Welcome, friends. Tonight we travel back to ancient Greece, not to witness gods or heroes, but something far more ordinary and far more deadly. The snacks, the sweet wines, the fried treats, the heavy breads dripping in oil. Foods so beloved that they could bring pleasure in one bite and ruin in the next. This is the story of why Greek junk food would kill you. Before we begin our long journey through forgotten kitchens and candlelit feasts, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. If you enjoy sleepy stories of history, whispered slowly across the hours, don't forget to gently tap the subscribe button. Leave a like so more wanderers can find their way here, and share a thought in the comments when you wake. Now, let the lamps dim, let the city fade, and let us drift back to the ancient table.
When you think of ancient Greece, the mind often turns to marble temples, philosophers debating in the marketplace, or warriors clashing on dusty plains. But those men and women who filled the streets of Athens, Corinth, or Sparta lived most of their lives not in moments of glory, but in the slow rhythm of eating, drinking, and trying to avoid hunger. And if you were to sit at their table, you might find that their meals were at once simple, repetitive, and, in many cases, quietly dangerous. The Greek diet is often praised today for its apparent simplicity: bread dipped in olive oil, wine mixed with water, a few vegetables, and fish when one was lucky. But if you take away the romantic glow of hindsight, you will discover that much of what they consumed was closer to what we might call junk food. Bread that could make you sick, wine that was deliberately contaminated, and oil that carried the risk of spoilage. This food sustained an empire, but it also slowly poisoned its people. Let us start with bread, the cornerstone of Greek eating. In Athens alone, thousands of men worked as bakers, kneading flour and water into loaves that could feed a city. Grain came from many sources: barley from the dry hills of Attica, wheat imported from Sicily and Egypt, but it was always ground by hand in heavy stone mills. Imagine the grit that slipped into the flour. Every bite of bread contained not just starch, but also flecks of stone. Over time, the teeth of Greeks wore down, ground to stubs by years of chewing. Archaeologists, examining skulls, often find rows of molars flattened like worn tiles, evidence of a life where bread was both nourishment and slow destruction. Barley was more common than wheat, cheaper and easier to grow. But barley bread was coarse, dense and bitter. It filled the stomach but brought little joy. The wealthy might afford white bread, softer and lighter, but even then, the risk of spoilage lingered. Grain that sat too long in damp storage grew mold, and no one at the time understood aflatoxins or ergot fungus. People ate it anyway. Some historians suspect that outbreaks of madness or convulsions in Greek towns may have come from bread laced with these invisible killers. To eat bread was not just to fill hunger, but also to gamble with your health. If bread was the base, wine was the daily drink. Greeks rarely touched plain water, fearing often with good reason that it carried disease. Instead, they mixed wine with water, diluting it heavily. To drink undiluted wine was considered barbaric, a mark of foreignness. Yet wine itself was no pure substance. It was often preserved with additives: pine resin, sea water, or herbs. Resin helped keep the liquid from spoiling in the heat, but it also left a sharp, bitter taste. Seawater was thought to improve digestion, though it salted the drink. The result was not the sweet clarity of modern wine, but a strange concoction that could upset the stomach as easily as it eased the mind, and wine was everywhere. Children sipped it. Workers drank it at midday. Philosophers, like Socrates, mixed deep cups at the symposium, the social drinking party where conversations about politics and love stretched long into the night. But wine carried dangers beyond drunkenness. Heavy daily consumption led to the same long-term problems seen today: liver damage, weakened bodies, shortened lives. The Greeks knew this in part. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, warned about the excesses of wine. Yet the warnings rarely changed habits. Alongside bread and wine stood olive oil, the third pillar of the Greek table. To us, olive oil conjures images of health. But in the ancient world, oil was not only food, it was soap, fuel, and sometimes even medicine. The amphorae that carried it from the groves to the cities often leaked, grew rancid, or absorbed the flavor of the clay. People stored oil for months or years, long past its prime. When consumed, spoiled oil caused stomach pains, diarrhea, and long-term harm. Yet, in a world with few alternatives, it was indispensable. The poor lived on bread dipped in oil, sprinkled with onions or leeks, washed down with diluted wine. Meat was a rarity, eaten mostly during religious festivals, when animals were sacrificed. Fish, though more common in coastal towns, was salted, dried, and transported over long distances. The taste was sharp, pungent, and often unpleasant. Vegetables like beans, lentils, and cabbage filled in the gaps, though these too could cause digestive troubles when eaten in large amounts. If we call this diet junk food, it is not because it was overly processed in the modern sense, but because it was monotonous, nutritionally imbalanced, and, at times, dangerous. Malnutrition was common. The average Greek body was shorter, leaner, and more fragile than we might imagine. Diseases thrived in these weakened frames. Children often died young, their small bodies unable to endure years of barley bread and diluted wine. And yet, the Greeks praised their way of eating. Philosophers spoke of moderation, of avoiding excess, of finding balance between hunger and gluttony. Food was less about pleasure than survival. It was ritual, necessity, and sometimes even punishment. In Sparta, boys were deliberately underfed to encourage them to steal, teaching cunning at the cost of comfort. In Athens, the poor stood in line at public grain stores, waiting for rations distributed by the city. Food was never far from politics, nor from danger. As you sit now and imagine this diet, you might wonder what it felt like to chew a crust of gritty bread, sip a cup of resin-soaked wine, and swallow a spoon of rancid oil. Would you taste bitterness? Would your stomach turn? Or would you, like the Greeks themselves, grow accustomed to it, finding comfort in the familiar even as it wore away at your body? For now, we have sketched the surface of Greek eating: the bread, the wine, the oil, and the slow risks they carried. But the question remains, how did these foods, so central to survival, become sources of sickness and death? When we think about ancient food, it is tempting to imagine it as somehow pure, untouched by modern additives, pesticides, or chemical processing. But the reality of daily life in Greece was far from clean. Spoilage was constant, contamination unavoidable, and survival depended on consuming foods that we today would not tolerate. What they ate was not always what they wanted, but what they had to accept. The problem began with preservation. In a land where summers were hot and winters damp, food spoiled quickly. Without refrigeration, the Greeks relied on methods that were ingenious but often risky. Drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting were their tools. Each worked to a degree, but none eliminated danger. Every preserved item carried the taste of survival: sharp salt, self-fermentation, or the smoky bitterness of charred flesh. Take fish, for example. Along the Aegean coast, fishermen hauled in bream, mackerel, and anchovies. Fresh fish was a delicacy enjoyed by those who could afford it on the same day it was caught. But to feed the inland towns, fish had to travel. The solution was salt. Small fish were layered in brine until they stiffened, then packed into jars. Larger ones were dried in the sun. These methods kept them edible, but only barely. Ancient writers complained often of the stench of preserved fish. The philosopher Plato even warned against eating too much, linking it to indigestion and weakness of character, yet people ate it gladly. Salted fish was cheap, filling, and available when other food ran short. At the marketplace, vendors sold it by the handful, its sharp odor cutting through the air. Imagine walking through Athens, past stalls piled with onions, olives, and figs, and then catching the unmistakable reek of salted mackerel. To us, it would smell rotten. To them, it smelled of survival. Cheese was another staple, made from goat and sheep milk. Fresh cheese spoiled within days, so much of it was aged, salted, or smoked. This made it durable, but also intensely strong in flavor. The Greeks ate it not just for taste but as a key source of protein. Homer himself described soldiers eating cheese before battle, strengthening themselves with its dense, pungent mass, yet here to lay risk. Unpasteurized, aged in clay jars, sometimes mixed with herbs or honey, Greek cheese carried bacteria that could cause illness. Still, it endured as a food both common and sacred, offered to gods, consumed at festivals, and treasured in daily life. Perhaps the strangest example of dangerous flavor came with the condiment known as gyros. This was a fermented fish sauce made by leaving small fish and their innards to rot in the sun, then draining the liquid. The resulting sauce was dark, salty, and intensely strong. It was used to season bread, vegetables, and even wine. Today, the idea of eating liquid fish rot seems unthinkable. But in the ancient world, fermentation was a miracle. It turned decay into nourishment. At the same time, it turned food into a potential source of sickness. Consuming rotten liquid was always a gamble. Some batches might carry safe bacteria, others deadly ones. The Greeks rarely knew which was which. Grain, too, carried hidden poisons. As mentioned earlier, ergot fungus sometimes infected stored barley and wheat. This fungus produced hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. Modern historians suspect that outbreaks of strange behavior, sudden fits, visions, or seizures recorded in ancient accounts may have been linked to ergot poisoning. Imagine a family in a rural village sharing bread baked from their own store of barley, only to discover hours later that one child was writhing in pain, another speaking nonsense, another unable to breathe. They would not have known the cause. They might blame the gods or witchcraft or fate, but the true culprit was the bread itself. Wine, too, was easily corrupted. Storage jars called amphorae were sealed with pine resin to keep the liquid from leaking. Over time, the resin mixed with the wine, giving it a bitter taste. Some amphorae were even sealed with clay plugs, which could crumble into the liquid. Wine could turn sour in weeks, becoming more like vinegar. To mask these flaws, Greeks added spices, honey, or seawater. Drinking wine was never just a pleasure. It was also a way of consuming bacteria, resin, or spoiled liquid without knowing. Even water, the most basic of needs, was rarely safe. Wells could be contaminated, cisterns polluted with animal waste. This is why wine, however flawed, became the safer choice. But imagine what this meant for the body. A constant intake of alcohol, however diluted, from childhood onward. The Greeks lived in a state of mild intoxication, not because they sought drunkenness, but because they feared water. Beyond the physical dangers, food also carried deep cultural meanings. In Greek thought, diet shaped character. Too much indulgence led to weakness, while a simple, harsh diet bred strength. Philosophers contrasted the softness of Persian feasts with the hardness of Greek bread and olives. The reality, of course, was less noble. People ate what they could, and survival meant tolerating spoilage, rot, and imbalance. But the ideal of food as moral training persisted. To eat simply was to live well. To eat richly was to risk corruption. This attitude explains why certain foods were praised while others were despised. Beans, for instance, were widely available, but many Greeks avoided them. Pythagoras famously forbade his followers to eat beans, claiming they contained the souls of the dead. Others believed beans caused flatulence, weakness, or even madness. Yet in poor households, beans were often the only meal. They filled empty stomachs, even if they carried stigma. Honey, on the other hand, was treasured. It was the only true sweetener of the Greek world, used in cakes, mead, and medicine. But even honey could ferment, crystallize, or sour. Some honeys were toxic, particularly those made from rhododendron flowers. Consuming this mad honey brought hallucinations and vomiting. Still, honey was sacred, offered to the gods, spread on bread, and mixed into wine. It was one of the few foods that turned risk into joy. As you listen to this list of foods: salted fish, spoiled wine, gritty bread, rotting cheese, risky beans, toxic honey, it becomes clear that the Greeks lived on the edge of survival, balancing flavor, danger, and necessity. What we call junk food today is often sweet, fatty, or processed. Their junk food was different. It was survival food that threatened survival, eaten daily, because no better choice existed. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is not that the Greeks endured such food, but that they celebrated it. Festivals were built around sacrifices and feasts, where meat was eaten in abundance only after being offered to the gods. The symposium, with its endless cups of wine and trays of olives, was not seen as dangerous, but as the height of culture. They did not view their food as flawed. They viewed it as civilization itself. Still, one cannot help but wonder, how much did these hidden poisons and daily risks shape Greek life? Did the slow wear of spoiled bread, sour wine, and salted fish shorten lives, dull minds, or weaken bodies? Or did the very act of enduring them build resilience, a kind of toughness modern diets can hardly imagine? That question lingers as we move deeper into the story. The Greeks survived. They built cities, they wrote philosophies, they sculpted marble, all while eating food that could kill them. But if their junk food sustained them, how did it also change them? And what does that tell us about the silent role of diet in shaping history? When you imagine Rome, you may think of marble columns, legionary armies, or bustling forums filled with senators in their white togas. But pause for a moment and consider those togas more closely. White, spotless, and gleaming in a city filled with dust, smoke, sweat, and grime. How were these garments kept so clean? The answer is stranger than you might expect. Behind every spotless toga stood the hard labor of laundrymen, men whose work reeked of urine, sweat, and soapstone. The Romans were meticulous about clothing, not because they lived in a sterile world, but because clothes were one of the few outward signals of status. A toga stained with dirt or grease marked a man as careless, perhaps even dishonorable. The toga itself was a difficult garment, vast, heavy, and impractical, yet required for public life. It demanded constant cleaning. And so, in every Roman town, one could find the Pholonica, the laundry workshop, a place that combined the stench of waste with the strict demands of fashion. A Pholonica was more than a laundromat. It was a small factory, staffed by slaves or freedmen, where clothes were collected, soaked, scrubbed, and pressed back into wearable form. The tools were simple: clay basins, wooden paddles, and most importantly, that's filled with stale urine. To us, the idea of using urine to wash clothes seems grotesque. To the Romans, it was practical chemistry. Urine contained ammonia, a natural cleaning agent that helped strip grease and dirt from fabric. It softened stains, brightened wool, and even helped fix dyes in cloth. Without urine, there was no Roman cleanliness. The process began with collection. Urine was gathered from chamber pots in households or even from public urinals placed strategically along busy streets. Some emperors taxed this waste, recognizing its value. The Emperor Vespasian famously imposed a levy on public urinals, and when criticized for taxing something so vulgar, he is said to have held up a coin and remarked, "Money does not stink." That phrase pecunia non olet became a proverb. Born from the business of laundry, once collected, the urine was stored in large vats. Clothes, particularly woolen garments like the toga, were soaked in it. Workers, often barefoot slaves, stepped into the vats and trod upon the garments, pressing them repeatedly with their feet. Imagine the scene: rows of men stomping up and down in tubs of urine-soaked clothing, the smell rising in the heat, the rhythm of labor steady and unrelenting. This was the foundation of Roman laundry. After soaking, garments were rinsed in clean water. Soap, as we know it, was not widely used. Instead, fuller's earth, a type of clay rich in minerals, was rubbed into the fabric. This clay absorbed oils and gave garments a brighter appearance. The clothes were then stretched, brushed, and sometimes bleached with sulfur fumes. The result, after hours of unpleasant work, was a toga that could pass as pure and dignified. But this cleanliness carried costs. The laundrymen, or fullones, lived and worked amid constant filth. Their lungs filled with ammonia fumes, their skin chafed from constant contact with harsh chemicals, their bodies weakened by the labor of stomping and scrubbing. Laundry was not glamorous work. It was degrading, dirty, and often dangerous. Yet it was essential, for Rome demanded appearances. The business of laundry was not small. In Pompeii, archaeologists have uncovered entire blocks devoted to phallonaceae. One of the most famous, the Phallonica of Stephanus, contained multiple basins for washing and pressing. Frescoes on its walls even depicted laundry scenes, suggesting that the work, though unpleasant, was a recognized part of civic life. Laundrymen formed associations, much like guilds, and held their own place in the economy. They were not highly respected, but they were indispensable. Roman writers occasionally commented on this trade. Some mocked the fullers for their smell. Others noted their role in sustaining the city's appearance. Pliny the Elder, in his encyclopedic natural history, wrote at length about the properties of substances used in laundry, from urine to sulfur. His interest was not in the dignity of the workers, but in the practical chemistry of keeping garments clean. For Rome was a city built not only on conquest, but also on practicalities. Behind every polished surface lay unglamorous labor. To step back and imagine the sensory world of a Roman laundry is to encounter a side of history often ignored. The air was heavy with the stench of ammonia. The floors were wet, the workers sweating, the garments heavy with waste and water. The sounds were of stomping feet, sloshing liquid, and shouted commands. This was not the marble Rome of imagination, but the working Rome of necessity. And yet, despite the filth, the fuller's work was tied to dignity. A clean toga was essential for a senator addressing the forum, for a merchant meeting clients, for a citizen attending a festival. Without the labor of the fullones, the social rituals of Rome would collapse. In this sense, the laundry was as critical to Roman order as the Senate House or the legionary camp. The irony was sharp. The brightest white garments, symbols of purity and honor, were born from vats of human waste. Roman society demanded appearances, and appearances demanded filth behind the scenes. The citizens wore their whiteness proudly, rarely pausing to consider the slaves and workers who had trodden it into being. But what of the workers themselves? How did they live in this constant world of stench and labor? What did it mean to be a man whose livelihood came from stomping in urine? To imagine Rome without its laundrymen is almost impossible. The empire dressed itself in wool, senators in togas, citizens in tunics, soldiers in cloaks. From the chilly hills of Britain to the sun-baked streets of Africa, proconsularis, wool, traveled, wore down, and returned again to the vats of the Phallones. The trade was not confined to one alley in one city. It was woven into the empire's very fabric. In cities like Pompeii, Ostia, and Rome itself, Phallonacy were not hidden away. Archaeological remains often place them near busy streets, their open courtyards visible to passers-by. A fuller's workshop was not just a workplace, it was a spectacle. One could hear the rhythmic squelch of men stomping in tubs, see wet tunics hanging from ropes to dry, smell the acrid bite of ammonia drifting out into the road. The city lived with this reality, just as it lived with fish markets, tanneries, and other trades that filled the air with scents far removed from perfume. And yet, the laundryman performed a vital public service. White garments marked civic rituals. A magistrate's toga, a bride's dress, a priest's ceremonial robes. Without the fullers, these rituals lost their shine. Imagine a triumphal procession: generals in dingy wool, priests in stained tunics, citizens in yellow togas. The grandeur would falter. Behind every gleaming celebration was the invisible labor of men treading in waste. This is where the laundry connects to the larger Roman idea of order. Rome prided itself on discipline, cleanliness, and control. The streets might be noisy and crowded, but the garments were bright, symbolizing a kind of outward purity. The fact that this purity came from processes considered filthy only deepens the paradox. Rome, perhaps unconsciously, revealed a truth that civilizations often forget. Refinement is always built on labor that someone else must bear. The empire's pragmatism was ruthless. Nothing was too lowly to be taxed, no labor too menial to be organized into a collegium. When Vespasian levied his famous urine tax, he enshrined this philosophy in law. Human waste became revenue. The stench of the poor became the profit of the state. The phrase pecunia non olet, money does not stink, captured more than the emperor's wit. It distilled the Roman view that utility excused all. If the empire could conquer nations, it could just as easily conquer the contents of its citizens' bladders. But if money did not stink, the men who earned it often did. Fullers carried the odor of their work wherever they went. Social prejudice lingered around them, even as their services were indispensable. One can imagine a fuller returning home, his children embracing him despite the stench, his neighbors turning aside as he passed. Work created both livelihood and stigma. This duality echoes throughout history. In every age, certain labors are hidden behind polished appearances: the cleaners, the waste collectors, the hands that prepare what others consume without thought. The Roman laundrymen simply embodied it more vividly, their toil marked by odor and exposure. Consider the irony once more. The pure white toga, the symbol of Roman citizenship and virtue, achieved only through immersion in filth. Cicero could stand in the forum, his robe gleaming, proclaiming lofty ideals of justice and order. Yet his garments, like those of every orator and senator, owed their brightness to men bending over steaming vats, their feet raw from treading in urine. Beneath the rhetoric of civilization lay the unspoken truth of maintenance. Archaeology preserves their workplaces, but not their voices. We can see the troughs and presses, the drains that carried away waste, the inscriptions noting guild memberships. We can see frescoes showing workers carrying baskets of cloth, yet we cannot hear their conversations, their complaints, or their laughter. Did they joke about senators? Did they curse the endless loads of wool? Did they take pride in a perfectly whitened toga? Their silence is permanent, their labor recorded only in stone and stain. Still, their absence speaks. The very fact that these places endure in the ruins reminds us that Roman life was not only senators and emperors, but workers and tradesmen. The city's smooth marble image its temples, baths, and forums was constantly maintained by the invisible labor of those at the margins. The Fullones were part of that margin, keeping the empire polished in ways that history rarely celebrates. And perhaps this is the quiet lesson their story leaves. Civilizations often shine brightest on the surface. White togas, grand monuments, ordered rituals all project dignity and permanence. But beneath the surface lies labor that is anything but clean. The sweat, the fumes, the waste. These are the hidden engines of appearance. Rome's whiteness, Rome's grandeur, depended on those who worked in filth. So the next time we imagine the city, the senators walking through the forum, the citizens filling the amphitheater, the priests leading processions, it is worth pausing. Beneath their garments was not only fabric, but history. History that smelled sharply of ammonia, that soaked through the feet of men in basins, that stained the hands of workers whose names we no longer know. And when the garments gleamed, Rome gleamed. When they dulled, Rome dulled. The laundrymen carried more than cloth in their arms. They carried the appearance of empire. But what did they think as they pressed the last folds of a senator's toga? Did they resent the man who would wear it? Or did they feel pride that their labor touched the heights of Roman power? Did they ever imagine that centuries later, strangers would ponder their work while their own voices had faded? The vats stand silent now. The urine jars are broken. The stone basins lie open to the sky. Yet the paradox remains, suspended like the smell of ammonia that once drifted through the streets. The empire that proclaimed its dignity relied on those who worked in indignity. And perhaps, in that contradiction, lies the truest image of Rome. London in the year 1666 was not a city of stone, but of timber and pitch. Its streets wound in narrow ribbons, twisting like a knot tied long before memory, a relic of medieval planning that never quite gave way to order. The houses leaned close together, upper stories jutting out until, in places, neighbors could almost shake hands across the street from their upper windows. Below, carts rattled over uneven cobblestones, while the air carried the mingled scent of fish markets, horse dung, smoke from countless hearths, and the faint tang of the Thames. For years, voices had warned that the city was a tinderbox. Fire was no stranger to London. Chimneys smoked and sparked. Ovens glowed in cramped wooden kitchens. Candles flickered beside hangings of cloth. A careless moment could spark a blaze. That the city, like all cities, relied on habit. Warnings faded into the ordinary hum of life, drowned out by the business of bakers, merchants, and sailors. London went on untroubled. Then came the night of September 2nd. The summer had been dry, the air sharp with the brittleness of wood and straw that had not felt rain for weeks. A wind from the east pressed against the city, rattling shutters, and pushing smoke low to the ground. In Pudding Lane, at the bakery of Thomas Fariner, embers smouldered where bread had been baked for the coming day. Perhaps it was a spark left untended, or wood to dry piled too high. No one knows the exact instant when it leapt free, but sometime after midnight, the small orange tongue of fire began to spread. the Fariner household awoke to smoke curling upward, to the crackle of timbers catching light. The family fled, scrambling across rooftops into the night. Only a maidservant was lost, unable to escape the growing flames. What began as a household misfortune was quickly something more. The bakery's wooden beams, dry as parchment, carried the fire outward. The wind, sharp and insistent, caught it like a hand fanning a spark. Soon, the fire ran along Pudding Lane, licking at barrels, carts and timber frames. London slept unaware. Fires were common, and the night watch had no engines capable of stopping such a blaze. Buckets, leather fire squirts, and hooks for pulling down houses, these were the tools at hand. Enough, perhaps, for a hearth fire, or for a small workshop blaze. But against a wind-fed inferno, they were nothing. By the time the bells of St. Magnus the Martyr began to toll, the flames had already climbed high enough to light the night sky. From the river, sailors saw the glow rising like a dawn where no dawn should be. Families awoke to shouts in the street, to neighbors hammering at their doors. Some carried what they could: chests of linens, small icons, jars of coin. Others simply ran, barefoot, clutching children, driven by the heat that pressed against the walls. The fire moved with speed that seemed almost alive. A blaze in one house became a blaze in 10. Roofs caught, beams snapped, windows burst with showers of sparks. The wind drove burning shingles through the air, scattering embers onto streets and across alleys. By morning, the fire had leapt beyond Pudding Lane toward the heart of the city. London's Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was summoned. Confronted with the flames, he hesitated. Tradition gave him authority to order buildings pulled down, sacrifices to stop the fire's advance. But hesitation ruled. Who would pay for the losses? What if the fire subsided on its own? According to chroniclers, he dismissed the blaze as small, saying it could be extinguished with a bucket of water. Whether he truly said the words or not, the moment passed. The houses were not pulled down. The fire continued its climb. As dawn broke, the city stirred into panic. The sun rose into a sky already thick with ash. Birds wheeled above, startled from their roosts, while the first columns of smoke turned day into a dim haze. Merchants rushed to save their wares, dragging bales of cloth and casks of wine toward the river. Families carried what they could too: boats, hoping the Thames might be a shield. But the river itself grew crowded, its surface reflecting the red glow of the growing inferno. By mid-morning, the fire was no longer a street problem, no longer a neighborhood misfortune. It was a wall of flame stretching across blocks, consuming shops and dwellings, leaping forward as if it hungered for more. St. Margaret's church fell, its timbers snapping, its bells tumbling into molten ruin. Sparks carried across to the warehouses along the river, where tar, oil, and timber were stored. When those ignited, the flames became a storm. Londoners watched in disbelief. The city they knew cramped and loud, but theirs seemed to dissolve before their eyes. The fire gave no pause, no mercy. Each gust of wind was another push forward. Children cried, women prayed aloud, men swore and swung axes against beams, in desperate attempts to clear fire breaks. But still the blaze pressed on, and so, by the end of that first day, the great fire had announced itself. It was not a passing accident, not a small inconvenience. It was a force, hungry and relentless, moving toward the heart of London. The city's long-feared nightmare had arrived. The second day of the fire dawned not with birdsong or bells, but with the rumble of collapsing timbers and the hollow roar of flames sweeping through London's narrow veins. The sun struggled to pierce a sky thickened into a sheet of smoke, glowing dimly behind the haze as though the heavens themselves had been stained with soot. What had begun on Pudding Lane was now a moving sea of fire, advancing block by block. St. Magnus the Martyr had fallen, its stones blackened and cracked. St. Margaret's too lay in ruin. But these were only preludes. On September 3rd, the true devastation began. The wind, sharp and restless, carried the fire north and west. Whole streets were swallowed in hours. Along Thames Street, warehouses of pitch, hemp, and timber ignited like torches. The river, which some had hoped would serve as a boundary, now shimmered with flame, as boats caught and burned, their rigging collapsing into the water. Those who tried to ferry belongings across often found their craft consumed mid-journey, the fire's reach stretching across the very waves. Panic spread as quickly as the fire itself. The narrow lanes filled with carts, oxen, horses, and desperate men shouting orders no one could follow. Children clung to mothers' skirts, carrying little more than a single blanket. Wealthier citizens hired porters to carry trunks of goods, though often the porters dropped them halfway, overwhelmed by heat or fear. The air was a confusion of voices, prayers, curses, bargaining cries. Every step was an attempt to flee what seemed impossible to outrun. The Lord Mayor, overwhelmed and indecisive, vanished from the scene. Leadership fell into a vacuum. The Duke of York, brother to King Charles II, and later the King himself, came among the people, urging the pulling down of houses to create fire breaks. But every delay, every hesitation, gave the fire more ground. Some Londoners refused to see their homes destroyed, even if the destruction was the only means of saving others. Disputes broke out at Axe Point, neighbors shouting as the flames marched ever closer. By mid-morning on Monday, the fire had reached Lombard Street, the heart of London's trade. Merchants scrambled to save ledgers, strong boxes, and letters of credit. Some buried valuables in gardens, others cast silver and gold into wells, hoping the water would keep them safe. There were rumors of looting, of thieves slipping through the smoke to snatch jewels and coin from abandoned homes. Whether true or not, the fear of it added to the chaos. All through that day, the sound of bells tolled. One church after another caught, their towers blazing like giant candles. When the bells melted, they fell with a mournful crash, their voices silenced by fire. By nightfall, St. Lawrence Jury, St. Sepulchre, and St. Mary Alebo had been reduced to ruin. The streets around them were nothing but glowing rubble, embers drifting upward like restless spirits. The fire did not confine itself to wood. Stone cracked in the heat, walls splitting with sharp reports like gunfire. Glass shattered, sending showers of fragments across cobbles already slick with ash. Those who walked the street stumbled through a haze so thick it seared the lungs. Faces were blackened, hair singed, clothes scorched. Some fell where they stood, overcome by smoke, and were left behind in the rush. London was a city of wealth, but also of poverty. The poor, who had little to begin with, lost everything. The rich, despite their trunks of silver, found themselves reduced to the same condition, wandering refugees, stripped of shelter, food, and certainty. On the roads leading out of the city, thousands gathered in camps of tents and wagons, their faces lit by the inferno that devoured what had been their lives. On the third day, September 4th, the fire reached its height. It surged toward the Royal Exchange, that proud heart of London's commerce. Built of stone and timber, it stood no chance. By midday it was alight, Its arcades and galleries turned to a furnace. Merchants who had once strutted beneath its arches now watched from the street as their world collapsed in sparks and flame. And then, most ominously, the fire pressed toward St. Paul's Cathedral. For centuries St. Paul's had stood as London's great monument, its spire rising above the city, its walls thick and enduring. The booksellers of Paternoster Row had filled its precincts with stalls, selling Bibles, sermons, and treatises. But those very books became fuel. On the night of September 4th, sparks caught the scaffolding that had been left for repair works. Within minutes, the timbers blazed. The lead roof softened, then poured down the sides of the walls in molten streams. Stones burst, hurled outward by the heat. Witnesses described it as an apocalypse, the great church glowing like a mountain of fire, its destruction visible for miles. Samuel Pepys, who watched from a distance, wrote of the horror, though words could barely hold the sight. The city's heart was undone. By now, the fire had consumed nearly 2/3 of London. The wind carried glowing brands across streets, over alleys, into gardens. Wherever they fell, new blazes began. Those who thought themselves safe found their roofs alight an hour later. Efforts to fight the flames seemed laughably small. Men with buckets and hooks looked like ants before a storm. Even gunpowder, used to blast fire breaks, was only partially effective, sometimes stopping the fire, sometimes spreading it further. At night, the city glowed like a furnace, the sky painted red. From the fields beyond, refugees turned to watch, weeping, praying, or sitting in stunned silence. Some spoke of divine judgment, of sins visited upon the city. Others whispered of foreigners, of plots and conspiracies, of arsonists sent by Dutch or French hands. Fear twisted into suspicion. Strangers were beaten, accused without cause. The fire bred not only destruction, but distrust. Still, the blaze did not relent. Streets once filled with the noise of trade, gossip, and laughter now echoed only with the crack of collapsing walls, the hiss of burning beams falling into ash. By the end of the third day, London was no longer a city of houses, but a wasteland of flame. The fire, like a living creature, seemed unstoppable, and yet, in its hunger, it had not finished. On the fourth day, the fire's fury began at last to falter. The wind, which had driven it so relentlessly, shifted and softened. For the first time since Sunday morning, Londoners lifted their eyes and felt a fragile hope. Where streets had glowed like molten veins, smoke now hung heavier, thicker, but less restless. The fire, though still alive, no longer leapt with the same unstoppable energy. It was not victory, not yet. The blaze still ran along timbered roofs, still consumed barns, shops, and alehouses. But the roar of it was slower, more labored, like a beast grown tired of its own violence. The king's men and soldiers, under the Duke of York, pressed harder with fire breaks. Gunpowder was laid, charges set against rows of houses, the blast shaking streets already broken. This time, the efforts held. With the wind weakened, the flames met gaps it could not leap, and there at last the advance was checked. By the evening of September 5th, the worst was over. Fires smoldered, sparks drifted, but the monstrous tide had spent its force. A quiet fell over the city, not the peace of rest, but the hush of exhaustion, of grief, of disbelief. A city reduced London had been wounded beyond imagining. From the Tower in the east to the Temple in the west, from the river north to Smithfield and beyond, a vast swath of the city was gone. Over 400 streets had been erased, their names lingering only in memory. More than 80 parish churches lay in ruins, their bells melted, their stones collapsed. Guild halls, markets, schools, and shops all reduced to ash. Of St. Paul's, nothing remained but charred walls and jagged stones, the spire a shattered memory. Where once sermons had rung and booksellers hawked their wares, there was now only smoking rubble, warm to the touch for days after. It is said that nearly 13,000 houses were lost, an impossible number, and yet every corner of the city bore witness. Whole neighborhoods were flattened, left as open fields of ash where once timber and tile had crowded close. And yet, even in this ruin, Londoners counted themselves strangely fortunate. For though the city's heart was destroyed, the loss of life was far fewer than many feared. Some spoke of divine mercy, that such a calamity of flame had not become also a calamity of bodies. Still, the faces of the missing haunted the camps and roadsides, their fates never fully known. The refugees outside the walls fields had become cities of their own. From Moorfields to Islington, from Clerkenwell to St. George's Fields, makeshift camps sprawled across the grass, families huddled under tent stitched from sheets, or beneath wagons piled with the remains of their lives. The wealthy, once clothed in velvet, now wrapped themselves in rough cloaks, sitting beside servants who had become their equals in misfortune. The air was filled with the murmurs of grief, of prayers spoken over and over, of bargaining whispers. Two neighbors, a loaf of bread, a jug of ale, a place by the fire. Tradesmen sharpened knives and mended shoes in the open, trying to scrape a living even amid disaster. Children chased one another through the ash-speckled grass there. Laughter thin and strained. Tea night. The city still glowed faintly red, embers pulsing under collapsed beams. Some said it looked like a battlefield after the armies had gone. Others said it looked like the end of the world. Suspicions and shadows, but ruin breeds not only sorrow, but anger. In the camps and the taverns that still stood, whispers turned to accusations. Some cried that the fire was no accident, that it had been set by foreign hands, by Catholic conspirators, by Dutch or French agents bent on revenge. Strangers were seized in the streets, beaten, dragged before magistrates. A poor French watchmaker, Robert Hubert, was accused of lighting the fire, though his story changed with every telling and his guilt was doubtful. Still, he was hanged at Tyburn, a sacrifice to fear rather than truth. Such suspicions were not new. London was a city of rivalries, of tensions woven into its fabric. But after the fire, those tensions burned almost as hot as the flames themselves, leaving scars not easily healed. The king among the ashes, King Charles himself, walked the ruins, his boots blackened by soot, his fine clothes dulled by smoke. He spoke gently to those he met, promising relief, promising that the city would rise again. His brother, the Duke of York, showed the same resolve, urging order where despair had taken root. Their presence, however, was not enough to ease the hunger, the cold, the sheer dislocation of tens of thousands with no roof over their heads. Yet even as tears were shed, the thought of rebuilding stirred. London was too vital, too central, to remain broken. Plans were drawn on parchment. Wide boulevards to replace the choking alleys, stone and brick to stand where timber had failed, churches grander than those before. Sir Christopher Wren walked the ruins of St. Paul's and dreamed of a dome that would rise from the ashes, more splendid than the spire that had fallen. The ashes remain, but dreams come slowly. In the days after the fire, the city smelled of smoke, of wet ash, of charred food. Dogs roamed the ruins. Piles of half-burned goods lay abandoned. Some searched the wreckage for iron, for nails, for fragments they might sell. Others searched for keepsakes, a single plate, a book half scorched, a piece of a hearthstone to carry into whatever new home might come. The people of London, weary and shaken, faced a long road ahead. But history tells us they did not falter. The ashes cooled. The rubble was cleared. New walls were raised. St. Paul's, reborn in stone, would one day lift its dome above the city as a symbol of resilience. Still, those who lived through it never forgot. In their dreams, the fire lived on a sound of bells melting, a sky turned red, a city unmade in a single week, a city transformed when at last the great fire faded. London was not the same city it had been. The map had been rewritten in flame. The people, scarred but stubborn, carried forward the memory of those days of fear, of flight, of loss, and of survival. For though wood and stone can burn, a city is more than its buildings. It is the pulse of those who dwell within it, the shared strength of those who endure. And so, from the ashes of 1666, London would rise again. In the early decades of the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was a place unlike any other in Europe. Canals gleamed beneath bridges, ships crowded the harbors, and the air smelled of spices from the east. Amsterdam, with its merchants and guilds, its printing presses and markets, was a city humming with confidence. The sea had been tamed, trade had been conquered, and a new sense of prosperity filled the narrow houses that leaned along the water. And in this world of charts and ledgers, of herring barrels and sugar loaves, something unexpected began to grow, something fragile, delicate, and strange. A flower. The tulip. It was not a native of Holland, nor of Europe at all. The tulip came from far away, from the Ottoman Empire, where its petals had been admired in the gardens of sultans. When the first bulbs arrived in the Low Countries, perhaps in the pockets of merchants, perhaps in the saddlebags of diplomats, they were curiosities, no more unusual than a bright feather or a painted plate. Yet they carried a beauty unlike the flowers of the fields. Their colors were deep, their forms bold, and some bore streaks of flame across their petals, scarlet chasing white, purple veined with gold. These streaks were not understood then. We know now that they were caused by a virus, a sickness in the bulb that made the bloom unstable, unpredictable, and brilliant. But to the eyes of 17th century Holland, they were enchantments, and enchantments have value. The first collectors at first it was the botanists who cared. Learned men, with cabinets of pressed plants and shelves of heavy books, prized the tulip as a specimen, a jewel for their studies. They bred them, traded them, recorded their variations in careful script. Gardens became their laboratories, each bed a page in a living manuscript of petals and colors. But soon the tulip slipped beyond the walls of science. Wealthy burghers, merchants who had grown rich on the seas began to seek the bulbs for their own gardens. To own a rare tulip was not only to own beauty, it was to own rarity, to display refinement. A single flower, blooming briefly in spring, could speak of a man's fortune more loudly than a gold chain or a carved cupboard. The demand grew, and as demand grows, so too does price. The market awakens in taverns and counting houses. The talk of tulips spread. Bulbs were traded not merely for gardens, but for coin. A man could purchase a bulb in autumn, plant it, and sell it in spring, at a profit. But some discovered they did not need to wait. Bulbs could be promised, futures could be made, contracts written not for the flower itself, but for the right to own it when the time came, and thus a flower became a commodity. There, names of the most coveted tulips passed from mouth to mouth, like those of racehorses or jewels. The Semper Augustus, with its white petals streaked by crimson flames, was whispered of as the most desirable of all, so rare that only a handful were said to exist. Prices climbed. A bulb might fetch not only gold, but houses, land, or whole businesses in exchange, and still they climbed higher. The fever spreads by the 1630s. Tulips were no longer confined to collectors' gardens. The mania, as it would later be called, had seeped into every corner of Dutch life. Not only merchants, but innkeepers, brewers, cobblers, and farmers found themselves drawn into the trade. In smoky taverns, bulbs were pledged and resold there, value rising with every hand they passed through. It was said that at the height of the craze, one could exchange a single tulip bulb for a canal house in Amsterdam, or for a ship laden with goods. Whether every story was true or exaggerated, the sense of extravagance was real. Flowers became fortunes, fortunes became fragile, and so a bloom that lasted but a week in springtime grew into a symbol of an entire season of wealth, a season that, like the flower itself, could not last. Imagine walking into a tavern in Haarlem in the year 1636. The air is thick with smoke, the smell of beer and salted herring. Men lean over tables, their fingers ink-stained, their purses heavy with coin. But they are not here for dice or cards. They are here for tulips. At one table, a man lays down a contract, promising a bulb of a rare viceroy tulip. Another man offers a barrel of wine and 2 fat oxen in exchange. Laughter, argument, scribbling calls, a deal is made, and yet the bulb itself is nowhere to be seen. It lies asleep in the ground, unseen, unbloomed. What changes hands is paper. The tavern has become a market, the bulb a shadow, the trade a game of promises. And the fever, the mania, is spreading. Contracts and futures. One of the strangest elements of the tulip trade was its reliance on futures. A bulb planted in autumn would not bloom until spring, but no one wanted to wait. Instead, contracts were written windhandle. They were called the wind trade. The buyer agreed to pay a certain price when the bulb was lifted. The seller agreed to deliver, but long before the flower showed its petals, the paper itself could be sold again at a profit. Thus tulips became abstractions. A rare bulb might change hands half a dozen times before it ever saw daylight. What bloomed was not a flower, but speculation. The prices climbed, the numbers whispered through the taverns grew absurd. A single bulb of Semper Augustus was said to cost more than 5,000 guilders. To put this in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn 300 guilders in a year. A modest house along an Amsterdam canal might sell for 1,000 guilders. The bulb, no larger than a man's thumb, was worth more than stone, timber, or labor. Some records, whether exaggerated or not, suggest that at the height of the frenzy, a single bulb was traded for 4 fat oxen, 8 fat swine, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 towns of beer, 2 towns of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed, and a suit of clothes. It reads almost like a parody, as though the bulb were a mythical object, a talisman around which wealth gathered. But to those caught in the mania, it was deadly serious. Who joined the trade? Historians debate how wide the mania truly spread. Was it confined to merchants and speculators, or did it reach into every household? Some argue that only a thin layer of society was involved. Others, citing contemporary pamphlets, claim that bakers, cobblers, even chimney sweeps mortgaged their livelihoods for a chance at tulip riches. What is certain is that tulip trading became a cultural event. Tavern tables became unofficial exchanges. Lists of prices circulated. The names of the most prized varieties: Admiraal van der Eyck, Generaal van Gouda, Semper Augustus, became as familiar as those of saints or soldiers. And everywhere, There was the sense that wealth could bloom overnight, as suddenly as a flower in spring. Pamphlets and parodisty mania did not go unnoticed. Writers and printers, always eager to profit from public fascination, began to churn out pamphlets mocking the craze. One such satire depicted traders clutching tulips as they drowned in a sea of debt. Another compared the flowers to whores, gaudy and fleeting, yet these warnings did little to cool the fever. If anything, they spread the story further. To mock something is to admit its power, and the tulip had become powerful indeed. A city of Bulbshalem, Leiden and Amsterdam all had their tulip circles, but Haarlem was said to be the center. The sandy soil of the region was well suited to bulbs, and the city soon became the heart of the market. Merchants, artisans, and even farmers crowded its taverns, eager to trade contracts over mugs of beer. The scene must have been both ordinary and surreal. On one hand, it was a typical Dutch tavern, with benches, tankards, and herringbones scattered on tables. On the other hand, fortunes were being made and lost in a matter of minutes, on scraps of paper that bound men to promises of flowers that might or might not bloom. The peak be the winter of 1636 to 1637. The mania had reached its highest pitch. Prices soared to levels that seemed impossible to sustain. Stories circulated of men who had sold everything they owned for a handful of bulbs, hoping to resell them at a higher price. Stories also circulated of sudden wealth: a poor weaver who bought a bulb and sold it for enough to retire, a baker who traded bread for a flower and gained a fortune. These tales, whether true or not, fed the frenzy. The tulip had become a dream, and dreams are contagious. The shadow beneath it, beneath the laughter and the scribbled contracts, unease was growing. Everyone seemed to sense, in some unspoken way, that the bubble could not last. A flower that bloomed only briefly could not sustain endless wealth. A bulb in the ground was still only a bulb, vulnerable to rot, frost, or theft. And so the question lingered in the smoke-filled taverns. How long could this continue? The answer would come swiftly. In the cold months of 1637, the market, like a tulip in its brief season, would soon wither. The mystery of broken nights in the modern world. We imagine sleep as a single, unbroken stretch. 8 hours, give or take, in one continuous block. Doctors prescribe it. Self-help books insist upon it. And those who wake in the night often feel anxious, as though something is wrong. And yet, for most of human history, the idea of sleeping through the night in one piece would have seemed almost unnatural. Historians piecing through diaries, court records, and letters of the past began to notice something curious: frequent references to first sleep and second sleep. It was as if, in the centuries before gaslight and electricity, the night itself had been divided into two distinct halves. A night in the Victorian age, imagine, if you will, a modest Victorian home. The lamps have been extinguished, the streets outside are dark and hushed. The fire in the hearth glows faintly, throwing soft orange shadows. The family retires to bed not at midnight, but soon after dusk. By 9 or 10 o'clock, most of the household is asleep. For 3 or 4 hours, they rest deeply. This is the first sleep. Then, sometime near midnight, one by one they stir. Not abruptly, not in panic, but naturally, as though the body itself knew it was time to wake. For an hour, perhaps 2, the household is quietly alive. The midnight watch. During this waking interval, people did not toss restlessly or complain of insomnia. Rather, they used the time. Some prayed, believing the stillness of night especially suited to devotion. Others read, tended fires, or checked on animals. Couples spoke softly or shared intimacy. Children sometimes wandered to their parents' bed. Neighbors might even visit one another, slipping between houses under the cloak of night. And then, when the hour passed, all returned to bed. The second sleep carried them until dawn. Evidence in ink. The traces of this pattern linger in Victorian writings. A farmer's diary might casually note, "Woke after first sleep, mended harness." A housewife might write to her sister of prayers offered in the interval twixt sleeps. Court records from the period even record crimes committed during those midnight hours, not in the dead of night, but in the accepted pause between rests. Medical texts of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries often referred to first sleep and second sleep without explanation, as if readers needed none. Only later, when electricity and industry began reshaping human schedules, did the idea quietly fade. A rhythm lost to us. The Victorian pattern of segmented slumber feels strange, even unsettling. And yet, for centuries, it was simply the way of things. With no artificial light to extend the day, people lived more closely to natural rhythms. Sleep came in two parts, and the night itself became a gentle arc of rest, wakefulness, and rest again. What we call insomnia today might once have been recognized as nothing more than the natural pause between the halves of sleep. A body built for interruption. When you close your eyes tonight, you may expect your body to travel smoothly through cycles of sleep until morning. But biology reveals something subtler. Human sleep is not a single, unbroken river. It is a sequence of stages: light dozing, deep slow-wave rest, and bursts of rapid eye movement. These stages repeat, looping every 90 minutes or so. In the candlelit world before industrial clocks and electric lamps, those natural rhythms often aligned with a longer break in the night. The pause between first and second sleep was not a disruption. It was part of the pattern. Modern experiments in sleep labs have confirmed this. When subjects are left in natural light dark cycles with no screens, no bulbs, they begin to fall asleep earlier in the evening and then wake calmly around midnight, rested but not restless. After an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, they return to bed for a second stretch. Their bodies fall into the very rhythm that Victorians took for granted. Melatonin and midnight science behind this lies partly in hormones. Melatonin, the chemical that signals your body to feel sleepy, begins to rise soon after dusk. In an age when night truly meant darkness, people were drawn into bed early, long before midnight. After a few hours, melatonin naturally dips. The body, having reached a threshold of rest, stirs awake. In modern times, our electric lights suppress melatonin, pushing sleep later into the night. This forces us to compress rest into a single block. But in the darkened Victorian home, melatonin rose early and subsided early, creating a natural gap in the middle of the night. That gap was not disorder. It was design. The social utility of the pause watch between sleeps was not wasted time. It served practical and social functions. Farmers might check the barns or secure animals against predators. Urban dwellers might tend fires, ensuring hearths did not die before morning. For women, the break was sometimes used to nurse infants, bake bread, or mend clothing. Men might write letters, prepare tools, or even visit a neighbor's workshop by lantern light. There was a kind of efficiency in the division. Work that did not fit into daylight hours could quietly occupy the space between sleeps. And because everyone shared the rhythm, no one thought it strange. The medical understanding doctors did not view waking at midnight as a pathology. Quite the opposite. Medical manuals of the era sometimes recommended the interval as the ideal time for prayer, contemplation, or intimate relations. Physicians described the first sleep as heavy and restorative, while the second was lighter, more dream-filled. Even dreams themselves seemed to carry different qualities across the two halves. The first sleep brought dense, physical recovery. The second carried the imagination, scattering stories and visions that were later recorded in journals or, in some cases, shaped into novels and sermons. A comparison across culture segmented. Sleep was not limited to Britain or Europe. In many pre-industrial cultures, from rural China to West Africa, references appear to divided nights. Anthropologists studying communities without electricity in the 20th century found similar habits. Early to bed, a wakeful period, and then a second sleep before dawn. What the Victorians called first sleep and second sleep may have been the human norm for thousands of years, only displaced by industrial timekeeping in the last 2 centuries. Industrialization and the sleep problem. By the mid-19th century, however, the clock began to compete with the body. Gas lamps lit the streets, then kerosene, then electricity. Cities grew bright. Factories demanded laborers arrive at dawn and work long hours. The old rhythm became inconvenient. Waking at midnight was no longer useful when mornings were rigid and exhausting. Gradually, segmented sleep was forgotten. Medical texts began to describe broken nights as a problem rather than a norm. By the 20th century, insomnia became a diagnosis. What once had been an accepted part of human biology became a source of anxiety. The quiet ironize the irony. Many people today lie awake in the night, hearts racing, fearing something is wrong. Yet they may only be echoing an older rhythm, one that kept Victorians company by the firelight. The unease we feel in waking at midnight is not because the body has failed, but because our culture has forgotten. The question lingers: is our modern insistence on one solid block of sleep an improvement, or merely a convenience? Has electricity lengthened our day, or has it shortened the richness of our nights? Forgotten until remembered for most of the 20th century, the notion of a two-part night lay buried beneath the bright noise of modernity. Medical journals, diaries, and novels that once casually referenced fast sleep and second sleep were left unread in archives. By the 1950s, psychiatrists and neurologists diagnosed middle-of-the-night insomnia as a disorder, prescribing sedatives or lifestyle adjustments to eliminate what was, in another age, a perfectly ordinary pattern. The rediscovery began with a historian named C. Roger Ekert, whose decades of work in the archives of Europe uncovered hundreds of passing mentions to segmented sleep. Court records described crimes committed between the first and second sleep. Letters written by spouses referred to waking around midnight to share a moment of quiet. Religious manuals offered prayers betwixt sleeps. Suddenly, what had seemed like scattered fragments became evidence of an entire forgotten rhythm of life. Evidence in the Morgenskirch, most influential work. At day's close, night in times past 2005, traced these references back centuries. One 17th century diarist described rising after first sleep to read scriptures. Another mentioned slipping next door to borrow a candle. Folklore told of night demons that haunted the hours between sleeps, revealing even in superstition that people expected to be awake at that time. This wasn't marginal behavior. It was widespread enough to shape language, tradition, and belief. First sleep was as ordinary a phrase as breakfast. Second sleep was a simple fact of life. Only when new technologies bent human schedules into rigid forms did the phrases fade from memory. Sleep experiments and the body's truth at the same time as historians pieced together old records. Scientists were running unexpected experiments. In the 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas W. Eacher conducted a study in which volunteers were deprived of artificial light. For weeks, they lived with only natural cycles of dusk and dawn. First, participants slept long and deeply, catching up on modern fatigue. But soon, their sleep patterns shifted. Without prompting, nearly all of them divided their nights into two distinct halves, with a wakeful period in between. The experiment confirmed what history suggested. Segmented sleep was not an odd cultural quirk. It was a biological inclination, suppressed only by artificial light and industrial time. The midnight hour, reimagined. So what did Victorians, and perhaps our own ancestors, do with these hours? The accounts vary. Some prayed, taking advantage of solitude to whisper words to God. Some wrote in journals or exchanged secrets with partners. Others slipped into neighbors' homes, knowing those households too were stirring. The midnight hour was private but not lonely. For some, it was an intimate time. Medical guides from the 16th and 17th centuries recommended it as the healthiest moment for marital relations, the body having already rested, but not yet sluggish with morning. Poets recorded dreams that lingered from first sleep and conversations that meandered before second sleep. It was an interval suspended between the practical and the imaginative. Why we lost its disappearance of segmented sleep cannot be separated from the march of industrialization. As work hours grew longer and more rigid, the efficiency of continuous sleep became more appealing. Urban noise and artificial light disrupted natural rhythms. Coffeehouses extended waking hours into midnight. Lamps blurred the boundaries of dusk. Employers demanded punctuality at sunrise. Slowly, society trained itself to think of uninterrupted sleep as normal, and anything else as abnormal. By the late Victorian period, the language of first and second sleep vanished from common usage. Children grew up without hearing the terms, and so forgot the rhythm entirely. The insomniacs are today. Millions of people wake in the middle of the night, feeling the weight of failure. They toss, turn, check glowing clocks, and scroll through phones in frustration. They are labeled insomniacs, prescribed pills, or told to adopt sleep hygiene routines. Yet in a different century, these same wakeful moments might have been peaceful. They might have been normal. What we call a disorder may, in fact, be the body remembering. A remnant of first and second sleep remains in our biology, reminding us that time once moved differently. Modern implication. Does this mean we should return to segmented nights? Not necessarily. Our lives are built around rigid schedules that demand efficiency. Most of us cannot afford to wake for 2 hours in the middle of the night and then return to bed. But the history offers perspective. The next time you wake at midnight, you may take comfort in knowing it is not always pathology. It is heritage. Some sleep specialists even suggest leaning into the rhythm, reading quietly, meditating, or journaling rather than fighting it. The Victorians knew that the night was not a blank stretch of unconsciousness, but a landscape with its own landmarks. First sleep, waking watch, second sleep, dawn, reflection. So we arrive at the quiet conclusion. The Victorians, with their dim lamps and heavy drapes, did not fear waking in the middle of the night. They accepted it as part of the human design, a space for prayer, work, or tender conversation. The modern insistence on a single block of sleep has erased this nuance, leaving us anxious when we stir at midnight. Yet perhaps something valuable has been lost in that erasure. The reflective pause, the private hour, the intimacy of the watch. Between sleeps these may have offered a richness that continuous sleep does not. We might ask ourselves, is uninterrupted efficiency worth more than those gentle interludes of wakefulness? When you next wake at midnight, you may find yourself wondering not what is wrong, but what has been forgotten. A city on edge of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 was restless long before the dancing began. The heat was thick, pressing down upon the timbered houses and cobblestone lanes. The river Ill, winding through the city, carried more than trade. It carried rumors, anxieties, and the slow seep of famine. Harvests had failed in the surrounding countryside. Bread was scarce, taxes weighed heavy, and yet the churches called for penance, warning of divine wrath for sins unnamed but deeply felt. I too was into this uneasy silence that the first dancer stepped. Frau Troffier's name was Frau Troffier, a woman of little note before that July day. No record tells us what had burdened her heart, whether grief, hunger, or simple exhaustion. What we do know is this: she walked into the narrow street outside her home and began to move, not gracefully, not like a courtly performance, but with a jerking, insistent rhythm. At first, neighbors must have stared. Dancing, in itself, was no scandal. Festivals saw whole villages spinning and stamping in celebration. But this was different. Frau Troffier danced alone. There was no fiddle, no drum, no feast. Just the sound of her feet slapping the stones, again and again. Long past the point of pleasure, ours turned to dice. A curious crowd gathered. Some jeered, thinking her drunk. Others whispered about possession, about the devil taking hold. Still others muttered about God's judgment. A body moved against its will, a warning for the rest. Yet when night fell, Frau Troffier did not stop. When dawn rose, she was still moving. Her husband, bewildered, pleaded with her to rest. Her legs shook, her body weakened, but still the dance went on. For 3 days she continued, collapsing only in moments of sheer exhaustion, then rising again to sway, spin, and stagger. By the end of the 3rd day, she was not alone. Contagion without tuck. This was the strangest part. Her neighbors began to join her. One by one, others slipped into the rhythm, as if caught by an invisible music. A baker, a servant, a cobbler. Soon dozens filled the street. No instrument played, no festival called them. Yet they moved, sweating and trembling, as though compelled by something beyond themselves. Chroniclers would later record that within a week, dozens were dancing. Within a month, the number may have reached hundreds. Strasbourg, already weary from hunger and debt, found its streets clogged with frantic, stumbling bodies. The questions begin: how was it? An illness? A curse? Mass hysteria? In 1518, explanations leaned heavily toward the spiritual. Priests preached that the dancers were afflicted by Saint Vitus, a martyr believed to send uncontrollable tremors and convulsions to the sinful. People prayed at his shrines, begging for release, but practical matters intruded. Dancers collapsed from fatigue. Some said to have died from strokes or heart failure. Neighbors feared contagion. Authorities debated whether to intervene or let the frenzy burn itself out. For now, though, the dance showed no sign of ending. The plague had only just begun. Closing the first cenithas, the strange tale of the dancing plague opens not with an army, nor a king, nor a battle, but with a single woman in a narrow street, stepping into a rhythm no one else could hear. Within weeks, the entire city would be swept up, bewildered and terrified. Strasbourg in 1518 would become the stage for one of history's most haunting mysteries, when ordinary people could not stop moving, even as their bodies gave out. From curiosity to crisis, by the second week, The dancing was no longer a spectacle, but a civic emergency. What had begun with Frau Trophäe now filled Strasbourg's winding streets and open squares. Dozens upon dozens moved without pause, limbs jerking, eyes glassy, bodies soaked in sweat. They twirled until their knees buckled, collapsed into heaps upon the stones, and then astonishingly dragged themselves upright to begin again. Neighbors, who once gathered to gawk, now kept their shutters closed. Those who had joined in the early days regretted it bitterly, for they found themselves unable to stop. The dance was not joyous. It was compulsion, a torment more than a celebration. Authorities take notice. Strasbourg's councilmen, already overburdened with managing food shortages and religious disputes, could not ignore the chaos. Chroniclers report they convened meetings to decide how best to respond. Their first instinct was practical. Perhaps the dancers simply needed to purge their frenzy, and so they ordered that space be given for the afflicted. Wooden platforms were erected in public squares. Musicians were hired. Fiddles, drums, and pipes filled the air, not to entertain, but to drive out the plague by letting it burn itself to exhaustion. It was, in hindsight, a terrible mistake. The music of madness. The logic was simple. If the body longed to move, then let it move fully until spent. Yet the addition of rhythm and structure only seemed to fan the flames. With musicians playing, the dancers surged in number. What had seemed like a small cluster now grew into a mass. Entire families were said to be swept in, children leaping alongside exhausted mothers. Apprentices caught beside their masters. The squares echoed with pounding feet, with sobbing, with the eerie sight of people gyrating until their shoes were soaked in blood. Some bit their lips until they bled. Some collapsed in convulsions. Others whispered prayers even as they spun, certain that only the saints could end their torment. The spread beyond Strasbourg rapids began filtering to nearby towns. The dancing sickness was not entirely new. Records mention outbreaks in the 14th and 15th centuries in other parts of Europe, often associated with Saint Vitus' curse. But Strasbourg's outbreak seemed particularly ferocious. Pilgrims and traders carried word beyond the city walls, and neighboring villages watched anxiously, fearing the same affliction might strike them. The psychological weight of these stories mattered. In a time of famine and plague, fear itself could become contagious. Some later chroniclers believed that hearing of the dancers was enough to trigger the compulsion, in others a kind of medieval mass psychosis spreading by rumor. The cast-in-flesh descriptions of the toll are harrowing. Eyewitnesses claimed that many danced themselves into the grave. Some collapsed with broken ribs, crushed beneath the crowds. Others died of exhaustion, their hearts giving out after days without rest. It is difficult to know how many perished. Some accounts mention dozens of deaths each day. Others are vague, leaving historians to wonder whether the numbers were exaggerated. But the suffering is undeniable. People continued to move long after their bodies had failed, as though will and muscle had been divorced. Religious explanation clergy, seeing the futility of music, turned instead to faith. Many pointed to Saint Vitus, the martyr whose feast day fell in late June, mere weeks before the plague began. They claimed the dancers had offended him, and that only pilgrimage and prayer at his shrine could end the curse. The city council eventually agreed. Groups of dancers were gathered, some carried in wagons, others stumbling on swollen feet, and escorted to the shrine at 7, some 30 miles away. There, they were fitted with red shoes marked with crosses and holy water. Ritual prayers were offered, relics touched to their bodies. The hope was that the saint would take pity and still their restless limbs. The medical theories of the day doctors of the early 16th century worked from humoral theory, the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Some suggested that the heat of the season had overheated the blood. Others argued the afflicted had eaten hot foods that disturbed the body's natural equilibrium. Treatments ranged from bloodletting to purgatives, though none proved effective. There was also the belief in corrupted imagination. If one mind became afflicted, others nearby could be pulled into the same delusion, as though thought itself were contagious. In this way, Strasbourg's outbreak became not merely a physical sickness, but a civic crisis of the imagination. The wider context to understand the panic, one must place it in the broader canvas of 1518. Europe was in turmoil. Famine lingered, epidemics flared, and the Protestant Reformation was just beginning to stir. Strasbourg itself was a city divided between religious factions, its people caught between church decrees and the creeping influence of reformers. Hunger gnawed constantly. When the harvest failed, bread prices soared. Malnutrition weakened bodies and spirits. The sight of neighbors writhing in the streets could only reinforce the sense that divine wrath was close at hand. A city transformed by late summer, Strasbourg was no longer itself. Markets were disrupted as crowds of dancers blocked the streets. Bakers, butchers, and tailors could not work with the constant commotion. Officials patrolled the streets not to maintain order but to shepherd the afflicted toward designated spaces. For ordinary citizens, daily life became a choice: to risk joining the crowds to fetch water or bread, or to remain shuttered inside, listening to the muffled sound of shuffling feet and the wail of pipes. And still, the question loomed: how long could this continue? Would the entire city be consumed, or would the frenzy finally collapse under its own weight? Closing this chapter, the plague had grown from one woman into hundreds. Attempts to solve it, music, ritual, medical theory only, seemed to deepen the madness. Strasbourg was locked in a nightmare of motion, where the streets themselves pulsed with exhausted bodies. And yet, like all things, the frenzy would not last forever. The season would turn, the crowds would thin, and the dancers would fall silent at last. But what would remain afterward? A healed city, or a haunted one? When we speak of Greek greatness, we often turn to their monuments, the Parthenon standing over Athens, the words of Homer echoing across centuries, or the sharp clarity of Socratic dialogue. But beneath these glories, there was always the matter of eating. The daily diet of bread, wine, and oil, flawed, monotonous, and sometimes deadly, left marks not only on individual bodies but on the fabric of Greek society itself. The health effects were profound. Archaeologists examining skeletal remains from ancient cemeteries note the same repeating patterns: worn teeth, brittle bones, signs of anemia, and stunted growth. These bodies tell the story of malnutrition, even among a people who wrote endlessly of beauty and athletic excellence. Bread ground teeth into dust. Wine dulled the liver and weakened the blood. Olive oil, consumed in excess, strained the digestive system. And yet, this was the food of heroes, philosophers, and farmers alike. Consider the Greek soldier, the hoplite. He marched in armor weighing nearly 30 kilograms, carrying a shield and spear. His diet: barley bread, onions, and wine diluted with water. Occasionally, dried cheese or salted fish supplemented the rations. Rarely did he eat meat, except after a victory or festival sacrifice. Imagine the strain on his body: endless miles on rough roads, fueled by food that lacked iron, lacked protein, and wore down the teeth with every bite. The endurance of the hoplite is often praised in military history, but that endurance was one against hunger as much as against the enemy. The Olympic athlete, too, faced similar constraints. We imagine them as powerful figures, sprinting, wrestling, or throwing the discus. Their diets were not luxurious but carefully rationed. Cheese, figs, and bread. Some ate large quantities of meat when training, but only the wealthiest could afford this regularly. For most, the path to victory lay not in abundance, but in strict moderation, pushing the body to its limits with food that barely supported such effort. The glory of Olympia was built, paradoxically, on a foundation of dietary weakness. Even the philosophers, men like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, were not immune to the consequences of this food. They spoke often of moderation, but moderation itself was shaped by scarcity. To warn against overindulgence in wine or meat was, in part, to acknowledge that few had enough to indulge in the first place. What they called virtue was often necessity, praising the simple life because it was the only life available. But beyond the individual body, food shaped Greek politics and war. Control of grain was the lifeblood of the city-state. Athens, with its growing population, could not feed itself on Attica's rocky soil. It depended on imported wheat from Sicily, Egypt, and the Black Sea. Without this flow of grain, the city would starve. The mighty Athenian navy, those triremes slicing through the Aegean, was not only a military force but also a safeguard for grain shipments. Bread and empire were bound together. During the Peloponnesian War, food became a weapon. Sparta cut off supplies to Athens, knowing hunger would do what swords could not. Inside the city walls, Athenians survived on barley, dried fish, and dwindling oil stores. The plague that swept through the overcrowded city was worsened by malnutrition. Thucydides, the historian, wrote of the despair of those who fell ill. But beneath his words lies another truth. Hunger weakened the people long before disease struck. The Greeks themselves recognized the link between food and power. Festivals and sacrifices were not just religious rituals but political acts. To distribute meat after an animal sacrifice was to show generosity, to bind a community. Leaders who could provide food were respected. Those who failed to secure it risked revolt. In this sense, bread, wine, and oil were not only nourishment but tools of control. There is also the question of lifespan. How long did Greeks live under this diet? Evidence suggests that many did not survive beyond their 30s or 40s. Infant mortality was high, driven by weak nutrition and disease. Those who lived longer often bore the marks of chronic illness. Yet within these shortened lives, they produced art, literature, and philosophy that endures today. It is a reminder that human achievement does not always spring from comfort. Sometimes it is born in the midst of scarcity, and so we return to the idea of Greek junk food. To call it junk is not to dismiss it, but to recognize its double nature. It sustained life while undermining health. It built societies while wearing down bodies. It gave strength in the short term and weakness in the long. It was, in a word, survival food, never perfect, always risky, but endlessly consumed. What does this mean for us today? Modern junk food, fast, processed, sweetened, salted, seems far removed from Greek bread or resin-soaked wine. Yet, the pattern is similar. We eat what is convenient, what is affordable, what is available, often at the cost of long-term health. The Greeks remind us that this is not a new struggle. For thousands of years, people have balanced survival against health, taste against danger, necessity against choice. As you picture an Athenian family at their table, bread crumbling in their hands, wine clouded in clay cups, a small bowl of olives passed between them. You may wonder, was their experience so different from ours? We eat under the glow of electric light, they under oil lamps. We preserve with chemicals, they with salt. But the underlying question remains the same. How much of what we eat today, like what they ate then, will slowly kill us while we continue to call it food? The Greeks left behind temples, poems, and philosophies, but they also left behind a lesson hidden in their daily diet. Civilization is not only marble and ideas. It is also bread and oil, wine and cheese, spoiled fish and bitter beans. The story of their greatness is also the story of what they ate to stay alive, and the silent toll it exacted. So as we close this first story, consider the quiet irony. The people who gave us democracy, philosophy, and epic poetry also lived on what we would now call junk food, and perhaps their greatness lay not in escaping it, but in enduring it. To stand in the heart of a Roman Philoniker was to breathe air unlike any other in the city. The ammonia sting of urine clung to the nostrils, the dampness of wet wool hung heavy in the lungs, and the clay dust of fuller's earth settled on the skin. This was the environment where men spent their working lives, treading garments for hours, bending over basins, and inhaling fumes. Yet despite the grime, the laundrymen were a visible part of the urban world. They kept Rome's garments white, and Rome, in return, tolerated their smell. The laundrymen for loans were typically slaves or freedmen. For a slave, laundry work was grueling but steady. For a freedman, it could be a path to modest prosperity. Owning a Philonica gave one a measure of independence, however small. In Pompeii and Ostia, inscriptions show that laundrymen formed collegia, or guilds, associations that provided support and representation. They might not have held prestige, but they held solidarity. Among their own, they found dignity in work that others mocked. Still, society placed them low on the ladder. The Roman elite valued purity of appearance, but despised those who created it. To be called a fuller was an insult in certain contexts, a reminder that one's livelihood depended on waste. Yet paradoxically, the same senators who sneered at the fullers walked proudly in garments that bore their labor. The contradiction was sharp. Society despised the laborer but could not function without him. The economic importance of laundry should not be underestimated. Rome was a city of hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million at its peak. Clothing, especially woolen clothing, was central to identity. Togas, tunics, cloaks all required regular cleaning. The sheer volume of fabric meant that Philonaci were always busy. Archaeological finds suggest they were often among the most substantial workshops in towns. The Philonica of Stephanus in Pompeii, for example, had several basins, a courtyard, and even a press for finishing garments. This was not a back alley trade but a visible enterprise. Urine itself became a commodity. The Emperor Vespasian's tax on public urinals, levied in the 1st century CE, turned human waste into revenue for the state. Collectors gathered urine from jars and delivered it to the laundrymen, who paid for the supply. To modern ears, the idea of taxing urine may sound absurd, but for the Romans, it was practical. Waste was valuable, and value could be taxed. The phrase pecunia non olet, money does not stink, was more than a clever remark. It was a statement of Roman pragmatism, a reminder that utility mattered more than appearances. Health consequences were inevitable. Constant exposure to ammonia irritated the lungs and eyes. Standing barefoot in vats of urine and dirty garments left workers prone to skin infections, sores, and long-term weakness. Unlike modern laborers, they had no protective gear, no gloves, no boots. Their tools were their bodies. Work days were long, the labor repetitive, the environment unhealthy. For slaves, there was no escape. For freedmen, it was simply the price of earning a living. Yet, curiously, the full loans did not vanish into obscurity. They celebrated their trade in inscriptions and even in tombs. At Pompeii, a fresco depicts a fuller pressing garments, suggesting pride in the work. The Collegia of Laundrymen participated in public life, sponsoring games or processions, just as bakers and builders did. They claimed space in society, insisting that their labor mattered. And in truth, it did. Rome could not appear civilized without them. Culturally, laundry carried symbolism. The whiteness of a toga was not merely cleanliness. It was a statement of virtue, respectability, and Roman identity. A soiled toga was shameful. Cicero, in his speeches, sometimes mocked opponents by describing their stained clothing, implying moral weakness. Thus, the work of the laundryman was tied indirectly to politics, for he preserved the garments of Rome's public life. There is an irony here worth pausing on. The Romans idealized the pure white toga, yet this whiteness came from filth from urine-soaked fats, from chemical fumes, from human toil at the edge of dignity. The very symbol of Roman civilization rested on a foundation of waste. To look at a senator in gleaming robes was to see, unseen, the feet of a slave treading in urine. Civilization, for all its polish, was inseparable from grime. But the story of the laundryman also reveals something broader: how Rome turned every substance, even the most unappealing, into a tool of empire. Nothing was wasted. Urine was not waste, but resource. Fuller's earth was not dirt, but cleanser. Sulfur fumes were not poison, but whitener. The empire thrived not just on conquest, but on the relentless repurposing of the ordinary and the foul. The laundry, in its own way, was a microcosm of Roman ingenuity, pragmatic and sentimental, efficient. Still, one must ask, what did it mean to live a life immersed in such work? To be defined by stench, to walk home each evening with the smell of ammonia clinging to your skin, to know that others wrinkled their noses as you passed. Did the laundrymen grow numb to it, their senses dulled by habit? Or did they feel shame, carrying the odor of labor that others despised but depended upon? The tombs and inscriptions suggest both pride and resilience. A fuller might declare his profession in stone, marking it as his identity. Perhaps this was defiance, an insistence that even the dirtiest labor had worth. Or perhaps it was simply practical, a way of stating one's role in a society where profession defined place. Whatever the reason, their memory lingers preserved in the stones of Pompeii and Ostia, long after the smell of their work has faded. And yet, despite the traces, much remains uncertain. We know the mechanics of their trade, the vats and basins, the chemicals and processes. We know their economic role, their taxation, their inscriptions. But we do not know their private feelings, their daily thoughts, their jokes or laments as they stomped in vats of waste. We can reconstruct their labor, but not their voices. This silence raises a question. In every civilization, there are those whose labor sustains appearances while being hidden or dismissed. The Roman laundrymen were essential yet despised, visible yet voiceless. They remind us that history is often written by the clean, not the cleaners. But what, then, was the true cost of Roman cleanliness, not only in labor and dignity, but in the very bodies of those who lived it daily?